Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the launch of Governance and Regulation of Charities, International and Comparative Perspectives. My name is Rosemary Langford. I'm Harold Ford Professor here at Melbourne Law School and Director of Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law. So let me first say that Melbourne Law School acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land on which the law school stands and pays respect to elders past and present. So we'll start tonight by welcoming Sue Woodward AM to launch the collection, followed by some comments from me, and then Sue and I will discuss some important and topical aspects of governance and regulation of charities, including recommendations for reform. You'll then have the opportunity to ask questions, whether you're here in person or attending online. So without further ado, let me briefly announce Sue Woodward AM, who no doubt absolutely needs no introduction. Sue has been Commissioner of the ACNC for exactly 1 year, I worked out, and in fact played an instrumental role in the formation of the ACNC. She was previously Chief Advisor for Not-for-Profit Law with Justice Connect, having been involved in a number of leadership bodies and having contributed to a number of charity sector organisations, as well as having previously been an academic here at Melbourne Law School, where I'm pretty sure she tutored me in corporations law. All right, so over to you, Sue.
Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge too that we're meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my deep respects to their elders past and present. And perhaps in this context, also acknowledge First Nation-led charities. It is actually, I think, to the hour, the end of my first year in office. Another first today is this is my first opportunity to launch a book, which is pretty damn exciting. So I feel very honoured to have that, particularly standing here at Melbourne University Law School, where both I attended, although in a previous building, because I'm slightly older, and also in my work life. I'd also like to acknowledge, and it's also nice to be doing it for Rosemary, because I've seen Rosemary grow and expand her career, and most pleasingly, since I maybe tutored her, which I've not quite remembered, but anyway, in her research on regulatory and governance issues affecting charities. So I'm very pleased that she's in this area. But perhaps a bit more of Rosemary in a minute. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of very esteemed former academic colleagues of mine, notably Emeritus Professor Ian Ramsey, and I think online Emeritus Professor Miles McGregor Lowndes, who's now also returned recently to be a member of the ACNC Advisory Board. I'm also pleased that there are some international superstars here, including a shout out to my friend Professor Una Breen, whose forward is actually the best reflection you can get when you want to know about the book. So I'm not going to usurp that role. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge all of you, both in the room and online, including my ACNC colleagues, Joe and Ruby. I think the combined charity, regulatory, legal and related knowledge in this forum is immense. I think the charity law quotient is probably pretty high. Nerd quotient is probably off the charts. So it's always a thrill to be with people who share a similar passion. So back to my job today is the launching of Governance and Regulation of Charities, International and Comparative Perspectives. I can honestly say I think this is a rich and innovative collection of perspectives that provide insights from expert authors on charity governance and regulation from multiple jurisdictions. And I really think it's quite remarkable that you can say there's 14 different authors. And I'd like to thank all of those authors for the hours and hours that I know that they will have put in. And obviously a very special thanks to Rosemary, because conceiving, leading, editing and producing that final result is something that I know has been a very big exercise. So when I looked at the book, which arrived last week in hard copy, the standout feature for me was really an insightful analysis of some key issues that transcend national boundaries. And as I say, you know your small group in Australia, but it's always really helpful to get those international perspectives. And I say that because I was also involved in the birth of the ACNC 11 years ago. And having access to the international perspectives we had then really made a difference. It did help us leapfrog, I think, over mistakes of others. And having had that advantage, it's always been really part of the ACNC, I think, to share back to others and to help others learn from our experience. And I've very much enjoyed working already with international regulators. And I think academics have a very important part to play in that virtuous circle. And the book is a really good example of that. I was struck by the number of jurisdictions: England and Wales, Germany, Japan, Hong Kong, Korea and New Zealand, just to name, I think, possibly all of them, but please let that be the case. And I think having both the common law and the civil law is also a real strength of the book. The overarching theme of the book is very much of interest to me, and it has been since I did my own research back in 2004. And that is this theme of transparency. And it does pervade, I think, just about every one of the chapters. And the collection in its various ways asks how we do straddle this tension between the need for charities to be accountable and the complex nature of that accountability. And I would argue very much that the accountability is much more complex than it is for business. Charities have much greater complexity. So it's great that the first chapter by Deborah Morris unpacks that position, the notion of accountability, and it's also the unifying thread right through to being rounded out in the last chapter, which is on individual accountability and board responsibility by Jackie Bettington. I think the acknowledgement of this tension is really important, particularly in the context of the ACNC, because our data shows that 50% of all registered charities are volunteer run. And 1/3 of them are extra small, and that means their annual revenue is less than $50,000. So when you're talking about regulation and complexity and stakeholder accountability, it's, I think, really critical to keep that context. And some of these groups, even though they're very small, still have the same number and complexity of stakeholders that the large charities do. They have multiple funders, the public, members, volunteers, staff, service users, carers of service users, and they also deal with multiple regulators: state incorporated association and fundraising regulators, the tax office, the ACNC, and perhaps the service-specific ones like disability, aged care, childcare. And then what I would call the general laws, so the privacy laws, consumer protection laws, insurance, just to name a few hot topics. So if, like me, you occasionally count on your fingers as you say things, you would know that you've run out of fingers at this point, particularly if you put it into the context of, say, a small charity running a respite program for people living with a disability and their children, and they work on the Albury-Wodonga border. If you start to go back over, associations, fundraising laws, all these different ones, disability, childcare, tiny volunteer-run organisation, I think you'll get the picture. From the tension about the rightful accountability of charities and how to provide it in a manner that is coherent, consistent and proportionate to compliance costs, the book points back to work Rosemary and others, I know Sue Barker in particular, have done about a framework that has at its apex a purpose-based governance duty. And I think the concept of a purpose-based governance is a worthy debate, and it could provide a cogency or North Star for the multiplicity of legal structures that exist in the sector. And so on the possibility of purpose-based governance, head to Chapter 3 by Professor Matthew Harding, and on a discussion on the specialist charity legal structures that could reduce the complexity, such as that charitable incorporated association, you should head to Chapters 5 and 10. And there's some interesting observations in both of those chapters. There are other chapters in the collection that critically appraise purpose-based enforcement and purpose-based regulation. And even in that context, whether it's about black letter law and or self-regulation. which is the best approach. And there's some good overseas examples there. Something else that's covered in the collection that is dear to my heart and my ACNC heart and my former fixed fundraising heart is the challenges of a federation. This is also topical when you think of the work of the Productivity Commission. And the book is timely, a timely piece of work in this regard, because I think its comparative analysis can help inform the discussion will come out of the Productivity Commission, their newly released draft report. And Christian Seibert's here today, so I'm sure they'll be plenty keenly interested. So really just to summarise the number of important themes that permeate the collection. It covers the nature of charity accountability, the refocusing of governance duties in the charity sphere around purpose, the importance of confidence and trust and transparency, the evaluation of charity law frameworks and regulatory approaches, and the impact of charity law reforms. And I think this multi-jurisdictional analysis of these themes is really timely and necessary, as charities both in the common law and civil jurisdictions are grappling with these issues. And again, thanks to the authors for insights from Germany, Hong Kong, Korea and Japan, and also to Matthew Turner for his useful overarching international context chapter and his reflections on charity commissions of the future. And I might add, I did do a search on the PDF and found there were 128 references to the ACNC. So I do thank everyone for their thoughts and reflections that we can take away with us. So I really going to sort of wrap up now in the sense that we've got a further discussion to have, but this collection represents the culmination of Rosemary's 4-year project on restoring public trust in charities, reforming governance and enforcement, funded by the Australian Research Council. And I know how excited Rosemary was when she first got that funding and the various conversations we've had along the way. It has involved a comprehensive and comparative investigation of governance and regulation in the charitable sector, obviously in a number of jurisdictions, and it has, I think, delivered on its aim of making recommendations for legislative and policy reform. So I know many of you in the room and online have a long-standing interest in the framework that governs the Australian charity sector and also the global context. So why do us charity nerds unite today so excited? I think it's because the regulatory framework for charities and the difference it makes for every single Australian. And when you consider the frameworks globally, the difference it makes to humanity, every one of us benefits from supporting, if we have organisations that support others, that protect human rights, that protect public debate and work for a healthy environment. So if you take that back, we need to have public trust and confidence in those organisations working for the public good, and they should appropriately be transparent and accountable for achieving their purpose in an ethical way, but without being hindered by duplication, confusion and laws that get in their way. So, oh no, I want my copy because it shows it's got lots of flags. I commend and recommend to you this collection and congratulate Rosemary and all the authors. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Sue, for those very generous comments and also for your support for my charities project. So I'd like to extend lots of thanks. Firstly to Una Breen for writing the foreword, to the collection, to Mark Siddell and Miles McGregor-Lowndes for their endorsements, and also to each of the authors for their important contributions to the collection. And I might just outline those contributions because I know it was a lot of work. So thanks to Deborah Morris for her critical analysis of charity accountability, which, as Sue noted, is incredibly complex due to multiple accountability metrics and the need to account to numerous stakeholders. And I know that's something that Sue wrote on years ago. To Matthew Turner for his comprehensive appraisal of regulatory approaches in multiple jurisdictions, and also his pinpointing or outline of future challenges that arise from digital technologies. To Matthew Harding, who's an apology tonight, for his identification of the conditions on which purpose-based governance can flourish, particularly concerning enforcement. To Sue Barker, for her advocacy of explanatory accountability based on a purpose-based fiduciary duty as the core accountability mechanism of an enabling legal framework. And that's one of the debates that permeates the book between restrictive and enabling frameworks. To Danielle Moore for her in-depth comparison of charitable frameworks in England and Wales and Australia, and also for outlining and making recommendations for a framework that really enables bespoke charity legal vehicles to flourish, such as the CIO. To Rebecca Lee for her insights on regulation of charities in Hong Kong, and in particular on the important role of self-regulation. To Birgit Weitermeyer for her significant critical analysis of recent reforms to third sector regulation in Germany and her recommendations for further reform. To Masayuki Tamaruya for his astute appraisal of major reforms in Japanese non-profit law, and in particular for his comments on voluntary governance codes. To Kai Jung Lee for his critical evaluation of the Korean charitable trusts regime. To Scott Donald and Ashton Cook for their important insights on regulation of investment by charities and their reform recommendations, and to Jackie Bettington for her exposition of issues relating to director financial literacy based on extensive empirical research. Finally, to Jordan Tutton for his editorial help and his assistance in writing the introduction to the collection, which draws out and comments on the themes in the collection, as well as presenting insights on charity governance and regulation. Thank you also to the many friends and colleagues who peer reviewed and advised on chapters, and to Miranda Webster for her assistance with an involvement in so many aspects of the project. And finally, I'm very grateful to some of my artistic consultants, Rachel and Esther, who helped me design the cover and who are here tonight. Possibly the most difficult part of the book was choosing the cover. But it was actually a challenging collection to put together, given the number of jurisdictions, both common law and civil law and languages covered. And Sue's mentioned some of them, but there were also other jurisdictions compared throughout the chapters. And given the complexity of challenges faced by charities in these jurisdictions, I've certainly found it's been a very complex area to research. So some of these issues Sue mentioned, things like proliferation or overlapping of governance duties and regulatory requirements. Sue also mentioned the delicate balance that needs to be struck in calibrating transparency requirements, indeed in calibrating regulatory regimes generally. Key role played by historical, political and environmental factors in designing, reforming and appraising charity regulatory regimes and reforms. And this is something I say to my students in my corporate governance research subject. You can't just take an aspect of one framework and plonk it into another jurisdiction without looking at those factors. The broad range of stakeholders involved with charities, as well as, quite apart from governance duties and regulation of charities as charities, the explosion of new laws relating to matters such as safeguarding occupational health and safety, terrorism, money laundering, fundraising, whistleblowing, privacy and tax. Not to mention crises from pandemics, natural disasters and climate change, and the risk and opportunities presented by new technologies and increasing digitisation. So these challenges, of course, confront charities worldwide, and I believe that cross-fertilisation of approaches and ideas, particularly concerning reform, is immensely beneficial. Indeed, I've benefited greatly from attending charity and not-for-profit conferences in other jurisdictions, most recently at Bucerius Law School in Hamburg in November, although catching COVID on the way home probably wasn't one of the positives of the trip. So Sue mentioned this collection represents the culmination of my project on charities, although I will actually continue to work and research in this area as well as in the corporate area. My charities project website, which is noted on the slide, has links to my publications and my final reform recommendations if anyone's interested. Finally, thank you to all of you for coming tonight, for your support, and to those of you who've been involved in and supported this project and others of mine, thank you. So now It's not really a fireside chat because it's summer, but.
Well, it could be. Look at the fog. For those online, it's very foggy here.
Okay, for our foggy non-fireside chat. As I mentioned, there are a number of themes drawn out in the collection. Sue's mentioned some, I've mentioned others, and these tie in with the issues and challenges that I've investigated as part of my project. So Sue and I are now going to discuss some of these, all the more interesting in light of the draft report on philanthropy released by the Productivity Commission last week. So I'm going to ask Sue some questions and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, none that are too hard.
No,
okay.
we've got a rule.
Relaxed, yes, okay. So Sue, one of the aspects of a number of the chapters that you mentioned is this overlapping of statutory general law and other governance duties, particularly in federated jurisdictions. And you also commented on purpose-based governance, which is something that I've sort of developed and that chapters in the book built on. I've also proposed a central set of governance duties based on purpose, settled in the fiduciary concept around which all these other duties could be organised. And the empirical research I conducted indicated that persons who govern charities, both here and in the UK, well, in England and Wales, would welcome that. So in other words, the idea is a central set of governance duties based in purpose around which the other duties could be organised as a way of simplifying the governance duties, which are complex. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I think perhaps in light of the context of which I set, and that is not that all charities are small, but that is a significant part of the registered charity register. If you go to the hallmarks of what is good regulation, I think you can't expect people to comply with anything they don't understand. So I do think there's something about simplicity there and consistency. So there is, to me, drawing all that thread together and explaining by way of a focus on purpose does, make it makes a lot of sense. Exactly how it's works, I suppose, is the next challenge. Bearing in mind that you'd have to the implementation would require agreement of others to, strip away what they have, and that involves lots of jurisdictions and various legal structures. So if you could start with a blank slate and get that in, that might work very well. I suppose it's just exactly how that can be implemented. Might be through a different type of structure, but would everyone transport to that? The only other thing that I when we were reflecting on this, I thought about is that there are quite a large number of people who both sit on business boards and sit on not-for-profit boards. And if they're going to have, in some way, a different set of what they might regard as a different set of principles, that might make that seemingly more complicated, even though we know that when they join a charity board, they should actually understand the differences in the nature of the organisation that they're involved in. And if you blur it a bit further in that it's not quite as simple as, business and charity, and there's a whole sort of crossover with the social enterprise sector, and I know Rosemary's here, and, there's a whole lot of blending of those boundaries between, if you like, the sectors. So I think it's a worthy framework. As I said before, I think it's a great overarching concept to put the others into, and possibly reforms should be considered in light of that as the goal.
Oh, that's interesting, because in my corporate work, I've been looking at corporate purpose and sort of purpose-based change across the board. So certainly lots to think about. So one of the, I won't say the most interesting, but one of the interesting parts of my research has been the empirical aspect, which has investigated the effectiveness of governance and regulatory frameworks here and in England and Wales. And one of the findings was that those who would benefit and would welcome guidance are those younger responsible persons and those from smaller and religious charities. And I do, in this respect, commend the ACNC e-learning models. I think they're really good. I've also made some recommendations, including exploring development of so-called 5-minute guides that are used in the UK, and perhaps hyperlinking the longer and shorter guidance and promoting the guidance to those ones who are sort of have expressed, interest in it. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts in relation to targeted guidance or empirical research.
Well, I think that sort of data, that sort of consultation that you do is really helpful for us to know where things are best placed, so that we do, our whole regulatory approach is founded on education and support. So making that as effective as possible makes sense. We are certainly very well connected with England and Wales, where they've been doing the 5-minute quick guides. And I think they're coming up to an evaluation point. So again, back to my leapfrog example, very much looking forward to what their evaluation shows at a time when we're about to review our own e-learning modules, because they've been out there for a while. I think it really helps, so we have people who answer the phone and deal with inquiries. So the advice team, the registration team dealing with organisations at various points, both when they start or they make a change, and also the compliance team. And having resources that each of those teams can refer people to as appropriate is a really important part of what we do. So I don't know, I perhaps from my Justice Connect days, I was always from someone who was really good at this, drilled with the concept of bite size, snack size and meal size. So I don't think it's a sort of cut one out and have the other, but I think that the example that England and Wales have done with the 5-minute guides is a really good one. And maybe we've got the meal size and we've got website material in between, but that combination and multi-formats. So there's videos to watch and there's things to read and there's, different ways of getting the information. And probably my last point there would be that I don't think it should just only be the ACNC. It's obviously our responsibility to make sure anything to do with compliance with our requirements comes from us and as clear as possible. In the broader governance sense, I think it's almost disrespectful if we duplicate or try and do differently what's already out in the sector itself. There's plenty of sector intermediaries, peak bodies, and the peak bodies, they'll understand what's the most pressing issue for disability organisations or, faith-based organisations. So it's about also working with them and also giving them the space to do that work.
I know at the end of the ACNC e-learning modules, which I did when I was recovering from foot surgery. At the end of each one,
It's always been conscientious.
There was a link to other resources, which was really, really helpful. And I know in terms of smaller charities, the ACNC has that
Small Charities Library.
So, I think that linking, where there's a linking between the longer and the shorter, is good. So just turning to issues raised in the book and generally everywhere now, things like crypto assets and digitisation, that of course was raised in the issue in the book, particularly in the comments made by Matthew Turner and Scott Donald and Ashton Cook. It was also raised in the Productivity Commission report. This potential impact of new technologies, the availability of new assets and investment opportunities such as crypto. And I note that you issued some guidance earlier this year on crypto, which I'm ashamed to say I haven't read word for word. So I thought I might ask you about that.
Thanks. It was, something that happened early in my term, that there was the collapse of the market in the US. I think he's now in jail, isn't he? Anyway, yeah, thank you. That it seemed the right time for us to issue some guidance, and luckily there was someone had already done a bit of a draft, and we finessed that. And I think it was quite an important decision to make, or it felt quite important at the time, because it, is it appropriate to say, look, this is far too risky, charities shouldn't be doing it, and sort of try and say no? Or if you permit, then do you give a licence to do something which ultimately could mean a charity loses some of its assets? And I took the view that we needed to support innovation in the sector. That's actually part of one of our objects, is to the sustainability and innovation of the sector. And this, I did know from my previous job that there was a small charity that came to Justice Connect that in the New South Wales floods, they'd been approached with a donation of cryptocurrency. They didn't know what to do about it. They got some fantastic pro bono legal advice very quickly. They ended up converting that into $30,000, which actually for that organisation in that situation made a big difference. So I'd also seen that it can work. And for me, the guidance was around not that we're the experts in cryptocurrency, but that we can say these are the sort of things you need to consider. And certainly what you consider in relation to donations and how you can mitigate the risks associated with donations is, I think, very different to the space where it's investing in cryptocurrency. And I think, there may be some very large, maybe a few charities that are investing and then maybe they have the right safeguards in place. I think when I spoke to a couple of the intermediaries that do that converting of the crypto into fiat, there was one in the US that said that they had been noticed appreciatively that our guidance meant that they then got more inquiries from Australia, which may or may not be a good thing. But the way that system worked was basically, as a charity, you could completely outsource your risk. So you just said, here it is, and you got back in X amount of money, and that seemed like a pretty good approach. And I think, how could I possibly prescribe what 60,000 charities do in their particular circumstances? So that's sort of been my approach on cryptocurrency. And it's a changing area, and we, the various conversations I've had with some of the advisor groups and some of the in-house counsel in charities, always asking them to bring forward examples or to tell me if they think that there's some new issue coming up in that area.
Interesting. Very interesting, very challenging. I certainly find it challenging. So we've touched on transparency, which permeates all chapters of the book. And it was one of the things I looked at in my project, which was an in-depth assessment of the ACNC's enforcement powers and practices with Miranda Webster, where we looked at partly the secrecy provisions, but also the obstacles that are sort of created by the constitutional framework, the legislation on which the ACNC is based, which really permits very limited powers against charities that aren't federally regulated entities, and also difficulties in assessing what is whether an entity is a federally regulated entity, lack of power to protect a charity's assets once it's deregistered, also limited power against individuals. So I did recommend that secrecy provisions be reformed and that serious consideration be given to a referral of power to create a fully federal regime. Now, we all know that the secrecy provisions are before Parliament at the moment, and that referral of power potentially is politically unrealistic. The Productivity Commission's made a number of recommendations, including that the ACNC have power to compel charities to give information in some circumstances, so particularly information so that the ACNC can assess whether an entity is a federally regulated entity. But at this point, the Productivity Commission has recommended or hasn't recommended referral of power. I know you and I have talked about referral of power before.
There's always hope, isn't there?
So I wondered if you had any reflections on any of that. That was a lot to ask.
Yeah, that was quite a package, but that's okay. So the secrecy provisions are before the Parliament and will no doubt be debated in the Parliament, as they should, in the new year. And I know there was a consultation process, and I know, I won't, it's no secret, if you don't mind the pun, that there have been your work, there's been the independent review into the ACNC Act, there's been lots of discussion about what's the best line to thread again. And it is a very hard thing to know how to navigate, because there's very good reasons for secrecy provisions, as there are in other regulators. And there are also situations where it's been evidence that the ACNC, it has been hard to do the job of being a regulator that's concerned with public trust and confidence if you can't speak when there's a sort of major public scandal, to put it that way. I think it's fair to say that if your charity is on the front page of the newspaper, the old-fashioned term, or, on an investigative program on the TV, you're sort of out there anyway. And I don't know that it really protects you anymore, that you've got people are asking, well, where's the regulator? Whereas what's before the Parliament at the moment would enable, in those very serious cases where the balance of public harm tips that way, I would be enabled to confirm yes or no, that there is an investigation into those matters. So it'll be interesting to see where that lands, and obviously my job will be to enforce whatever happens. But I do think it's a very important debate to be had. So that was secrecy. I think there was a federally regulated entity point. I don't know. It's taken a while to fix the fundraising laws, and we're not quite there yet.
Anyone can.
Well, it's not my place to do it, but it is understandable why it was a limitation in the Act. I suppose what I would say is, if you want to have the full toolkit to deal with situations that arise, as any modern regulator should have, then it's very hard if there's a distinction between who's on your register and what tools you can use for this one and what you can use for that one. And even working out, as you said, without going into sort of boring detail about it, is very complex. It's not as though it's, if you're a company, you've got this toolkit, people would sort of know, but actually this concept of federally regulated entity is not one that you can look up or find out about. And obviously for us to even get the necessary clearance to that's the case, we have to have a whole lot of evidence about it. How do you get that evidence? You're sort of imposing on a charity to have to get it, even when it might not have gone very far in any investigation. So I do think that's something that I hope, if some of the other recommendations that the draft report talks about, which brings states and territories together to discuss charity regulation, I hope it makes it onto their agenda and that conversation can be had. The proposal, I think, that's in the draft report about the states and territories agreeing to the ACNC having a power to go to a Supreme Court about assets, that may be useful. Maybe from there they might see that there's some value in extending that. The problem, I would say, is probably more that as a national regulator, if you've got some states that give you some power and then other states that don't, that is also going to make it complex and hard. And how do you explain to, well, a national charity how it's working, or a charity that works across two states, or one charity, it's like, oh, you're picking on us because we're in South Australia and our government agreed. It does really need that consensus approach, and hopefully if the recommendation of the Productivity Commission proceeds and there is that forum, that might be a way to do it. I mean, we're certainly very much in touch with all the state and territory regulators in any event. And I do think I've been really pleased in my first year that there does seem to be a good sense of goodwill and camaraderie around, doing the best that we can for the Australian public, basically.
Wow, well, it certainly is an interesting report. One of the other things that the Productivity Commission recommended was that the ACNC Act be amended to introduce a binding ruling scheme for the ACNC. I'm sure you've read that. I'll ask you if you've read it. Any thoughts on that recommendation?
Again,
What old
well, I mean, we'll do what we give powers, what powers we're given will be the powers that we can use. And I understand why that's something that could be really helpful for charities and their advisors. It makes sense, particularly in very complex, essentially, commercial type arrangements, building complex housing projects, navigating complex structuring, that you might want to make sure that before you expend that money that you've got some degree of certainty that your charity status is all sort of in the right space. I would just have to say that with current resources that would not be possible. So it comes with a resourcing imperative. And I know it's been taken from the, it's a concept we all know very well from the tax office. They are a very big machine and they have a lot of people, a lot of staff, 1,000 staff plus probably, that work on binding rulings, whereas in what we are called a small agency, I call us a speedboat actually, but we're a small agency. If we needed to have a commensurate number of staff, that's quite a big thing. And the only other thing I would say is that we know that a lot of charities don't have representation, they don't have lawyers, and it would be very tempting, I would think, if I was a small charity and I needed to check something out, rather than paying a lawyer, I could maybe ask for some free binding advice. And I'm not sure that any organisation could be resourced sufficiently to cover that sort of that volume. But, the concept of it, maybe just it's about tweaking the situations in which that can happen and getting the resources to go with it. That could be, could be very useful.
No, that's interesting. So I'll just say it now, red tape is one of the things that constantly comes through certainly in my empirical research in lots of reviews of the sector, in the sense of duplication, inconsistency between different reporting and regulatory requirements and the number of different regulators involved in the sector. It was something, of course, that came out in the Productivity Commission draft report as well. So there've been a number of suggestions as to how to combat that. The most recent I've read was the Productivity Commission's recommendation of the establishment of a National Charity Regulators Forum to improve coordination and information sharing among regulators. Again, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, or just generally on combating red tape and regulatory burden.
Yeah, I mean, that was the recommendation I was referring to before.
Yes.
I think it's, it is already a thing that we have committees and forums that join up in that way, but anything that lifts up and highlights, I suppose, the charity regulator space and brings people to the table at the right level, I think is really only going to be for the better of the overall regulatory framework. And absolutely, I think that could be useful. The Assistant Minister for Charities, Andrew Lee, did say to me something about, he would try and get all the charity ministers from all the states and territories together. And I said, well, that's good. I'm not sure who they are, but, because they don't have the same portfolios as they do at the Commonwealth level. So if we could use that forum to get the right people at the table at the right level and use that as a, more formal agenda setting, so you don't have to wait to hear if it made it onto the agenda of the Consumer Affairs ministers that deal with, rooming houses, broken down cars and 37 other portfolios, and then, they think about corporate associations at the end. I think that could be really helpful.
So volunteers, the sector is distinctive for so many reasons, one of which is the high level of volunteers. And one of the things I've been attuned to, a theme that permeates the collection, is finding the right balance between accountability and not deterring volunteers, not having a charity regulatory regime that deters volunteers, deters charitable activity. So some practical steps that have been suggested are sort of free national screening for volunteers, perhaps combined with insurance. So I wanted to ask you what you think are the key ways of supporting and encouraging volunteers.
Well, I think it's still in my remit, although it's not strictly what a regulator talks about, but I think it is, of key importance to us because of the stats about the number of volunteers and also our object about supporting the sustainability of the sector, and you can't do that one without the other. I think it's pretty horrifying, to be blunt, that we don't have a nationally consistent working with children check. How many years? I think 2014 since the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So if we could get that sorted out, that might be particularly in an environment where volunteer numbers have declined. Our data shows that they've reduced over the last 3 years, and we don't yet know. I mean, other data shows there's not really much. There's still a lag from pre-COVID. So that is, why not take away every possible barrier that might be there? And I think insurance and screening checks, which might not be top of mind when you volunteer, but they are sort of important. And I did was able to speak to the group of not-for-profit legal and governance forum that they have. So these are in-house counsel in a whole range of charities, particularly probably the large ones. And I did ask them what was sort of the hot issue that they're facing, and they, I didn't need to write the script. They just jumped on this and they said, oh, the biggest red tape burden is all this. And they had every example of, they can't, workforce is so hard to attract, volunteer and paid, and they can't, how do you just get someone in the door and they've signed up, but then you have to wait for their check, and, and it's not consistent. And there's been some absolutely, we've all read very terrible cases where possibly someone has been working without checks or the checks haven't been consistent. So I think it is what I hear out there, and other people in this room might have a different view, but I hear that this is a really hot issue, and it's one that we should be capable of fixing because it doesn't have to take money. I think anything that's can be done about that's certainly very useful.
That's interesting because that came up in the interviews I conducted after my survey,
Yeah.
even though I didn't ask about it specifically.
Okay, yeah.
It was a specific point. So thank you so much for your insights. There is a discount flyer over there if anyone would like to enjoy a 35% discount off the book. But thank you all so much for coming along and for your support in relation to this book and my charities project in general. And I'd also like to thank Avril and Valiti for helping with the event. So there does seem to be still some food and drinks there. You've all been very good sitting here for such a long time. Please have some more, and thanks again, Sue.
Thank you.